So Jeffrey, great to have you on the show. So
Thank you very much.
as we mark 80 years since the end of the Second World War, do you think that this shared history still carries weight today as foundation for further dialogue or mutual understanding?
Unfortunately, not very much. Leaders in the United States seem to forget that China and Russia, or the Soviet Union then, were allies in the war in World War II. Now, from the U.S. political vantage point, both Russia and China are regarded as enemies. This is a tragedy. It's a huge mistake. It's a failure of memory. It's a failure of perspective, and it's quite dangerous.
And what do you think are the major reasons behind this?
I think there's one overwhelming reason, and that is the U.S. self-understanding that it should dominate the world. The U.S. ideology is one of dominance or primacy or hegemony, depending on what word you'd like to choose. But the U.S. Political system, the political class, views itself as the rightful rulers of the world, in essence. Of course, in my view, this is utterly delusional, but it means that there is not effective diplomacy, mutual respect, mutual accommodation. The U.S. pushes its desires up against the other major powers relentlessly. In the case of Russia, for example, the main U.S. action over the last 30 years has been to expand NATO, to abandon the nuclear arms control framework. The U.S. walked out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. It walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty in 2019. It has declared its aim to expand NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia, putting Russian security in great risk. When it comes to East Asia, obviously the United States has built up its military all along China's rimlands and its sea lanes, and the United States arms Taiwan over the vociferous objections of Beijing. So all of this is a demonstration of the U.S. attitude that it can and should do what it wants to do anywhere in the world, irrespective of principles, of reciprocity, of prudence, of international law. And I think that this is the biggest problem we face, especially since the United States is hardly the hegemonic power in the world. This is a multipolar world that we're in. But the U.S. seems to believe that it still has preeminence militarily, financially, technologically, in ways that are simply not true. That discordance of reality and self-promotion is, to my mind, the single most dangerous element of the world today.
It seems like you believe it's all America's fault.
I think it's predominantly America's fault because America has been the most powerful country in the world, but not the only power. But by being the most powerful country in the world, it had the opportunity to shape a lasting peace. It had the opportunity to exercise restraint in the question of NATO, for example. Indeed, most Americans don't know, and all political leaders in the United States lie about it, but the United States promised President Gorbachev in February 1990 that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. But the U.S. prevaricated, and then it completely violated its own promise. When it comes to Taiwan, the United States adopts the one China policy ostensibly. In the 1982 communique with Beijing, it said it would phase out its arms sales to Taiwan, but it's not phasing them out, it's phasing them up. And so the reason that I put so much responsibility on the United States is the fact that the U.S. is the only country in the world that has military bases all over the world, in 80 countries, perhaps 750 or so military bases. The United States is the only country that presumes to dictate rules to others. The U.S. is the country that puts unilateral sanctions on other countries making demands. So this is why I put the responsibility on the U.S. side. Now, if the U.S. were truly acting in a prudent and restrained manner, if the United States was showing respect to Russian national security interests and to China's national security interests, and despite that, China or Russia was somehow provoking, then I would have a different view. But the view that I have is based on the actual historical experience of the last 30 years, where I would say the aggravating factors have been U.S. actions, whether NATO enlargement, abandoning the nuclear framework, or many wars of choice that the United States has undertaken in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and the rampant use of these unilateral sanctions, which are also against international law. So that's why I personally view this as something that the United States needs to control, can control, and should have controlled.
Well, Jeffrey, at present, we're witnessing two major wars in Europe and the Middle East. In the meantime, the United States has launched this tariff war on the world, fueling uncertainty and instability. So, from your perspective, do you think we're heading towards another major conflict? Do you think we're going to have the Third World War?
It can't be ruled out. First of all, we know in history that even the improbable can happen, and the results can be vastly more devastating than anyone could have imagined. I think 1914 August is vivid enough. Europe was prosperous. There was no cause for war. The assassination of the Archduke of the Habsburg Empire became the occasion for what turned into a mass slaughter of millions of people. And when that war broke out in August 1914, and the armies confidently marched out to the battlefield, they thought it would be a 30-day affair. It turned out to be a 4-year bloody catastrophe that cast a shadow until today, more than a century later. So there's lots of unpredictability. And we have so many flashpoints. We have so many irresponsible leaders in the United States. We have so many accidents waiting to happen. We have the U.S. and UK, which is also an unbelievably irresponsible government that is essentially launching missiles into Russia, which you can't imagine a more clear provocation. When Ukraine pushes the button, everybody understands that it's U.S. weapon systems, U.S. intelligence, U.S. tracking, U.S. personnel, in fact, enabling those missile attacks. So how can one rule out anything in this kind of context? You have a president of the United States with an attention span of 15 minutes who makes threats and ultimatums to other countries, who is complicit in a genocide that is ongoing in Gaza. It's not a pretty picture. It's quite a dangerous picture. What has kept us out of war is the prudence of China and of Russia, actually, because Russia has not retaliated even when clearly the Western security agencies supported Ukraine, for example, to attack a part of Russia's nuclear triad just a few weeks ago. Well, this is such a an unbelievably reckless kind of action that the West takes. But the Russian response was not to escalate that further. What's missing in all of this, I have to say, is true diplomacy. True diplomacy is not that the United States dictates, you must have an unconditional ceasefire in 10 days. That's not diplomacy. True diplomacy is you sit, you discuss, you negotiate, you listen to the other side, you take into account the concerns of the other side, you find a mutual accommodation. One of the things of the Ukraine war, for example, is the Americans demand an immediate ceasefire, unconditional. The Russians say, well, there are root causes of this war, notably NATO enlargement, the coup that the U.S. Helped to lead in February 2014 that brought this regime to power in Ukraine, and so forth. The United States doesn't want to discuss any of those root causes. That means no diplomacy. Or look at the war in Gaza. Israel is starving 2 million people in front of our eyes. People are dying every day. They go to the food emergency points, and then the Israeli soldiers shoot at them and kill them in cold blood in front of the cameras. No denying it. Then you have Israelis bragging about all of this. So there's a genocide that's underway. What does the U.S. say? The U.S. uses rhetoric, release the hostages, Hamas, but it doesn't willingly get to root causes. Israel's occupation of Palestine and the need for a two-state solution, which more than 180 countries of the United Nations believe in. So again, if you don't discuss the real political issues, if you just make demands, that's not diplomacy, and it's also not conducive to peace.
Well, speaking of diplomacy, Jeffrey, the end of the Second World War led to the founding of the United Nations. Do you believe that post-war institutions like the United Nations still reflect the realities of today's multipolar world?
We need the United Nations more than ever because our interconnectedness is greater than ever. We need global governance to stop nuclear proliferation, to protect the Earth's physical systems from our self-destruction, to end wars. So the reason for the UN is stronger than ever. The effectiveness of the UN is very low right now. And understand that I work at and with and for the UN, and I say this with great sadness that we need the UN more than ever, but it is not effective. And the reason it's not effective is the United States is in open war with the UN. The U.S. is the country in the world by objective criteria that is least aligned with the UN Charter. I do a study each year measuring each government's alignment with the UN Charter, General Assembly, and UN Security Council, UN agencies, and the U.S. comes out last of the 193 countries. So the country that essentially invented the UN, because this was the brainchild of our greatest president, Franklin Roosevelt, is now in open battle with the UN, open battle on every front. It uses its veto in the Security Council to stop war, to prevent the emergence of peace, for example, in the Middle East, or to implement the two-state solution. It walks out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It doesn't pay its dues to the UN. It leaves UN organizations like UNESCO and World Health Organization. It doesn't sign UN treaties. So all of this has weakened the UN. The UN needs a UN 2.0. In other words, don't be cynical and give up on the UN. Understand its vital role in the world and strengthen the UN.
What is the UN 2.0, and do you think what happened to the League of Nations will happen to the UN now?
The League of Nations is, of course, the dire possibility that we face. What happened with the League of Nations is that it was founded in 1921, and then when the crises of the 1930s came, it proved inactive and incapable of maintaining the peace. And now we have the UN in the face of an ongoing war in Ukraine, in face of the catastrophe in Gaza, in face of the growing environmental crises in which the UN treaties play a central role. And the UN, as an organization, cannot respond adequately, partly because the U.S. Puts vetoes in place, partly because the UN doesn't have a dedicated budget that is adequate to the task, and the United States and other countries don't pay even the tiny amounts that they're due under the core UN budget. UN Security Council resolutions come and go without being enforced. So all of this means that we need an upgraded UN system. The UN needs its own adequate financing. I have recommended that taxes be put on international shipping, on international aviation, on international financial transactions, on emissions of carbon dioxide, on other tax bases that should provide directly the revenues that one needs for global governance. I have advocated repeatedly for the UN Security Council to be upgraded, of course, for the whole veto process to be overhauled so that one country cannot willfully oppose the overwhelming consensus of the global community, which is exactly what the United States is doing today, for example, in the question of Israel's genocide in Gaza. There are many other reforms that have been recommended for the UN, including also even a UN parliament alongside the UN General Assembly. In other words, making the UN bicameral, two chambers, one that is one country, one vote, and one that is more representative of population in a kind of global parliament. I think this is a very good idea, actually.
And do you think that will? And do you think that will help stabilize world governance after the reforms you suggested?
The most basic point is that we have moved from a bipolar Cold War to a self-proclaimed unipolar U.S. world to a truly multipolar world. That's the world that we're in right now. But we don't have the multilateralism. We don't have the ethics, the spirit, the diplomacy, or the UN institutional mechanisms for a safe and fair and law-based multipolarity. So the world's different now, 80 years after the end of World War II. We can see why the UN is essential and also why it's not working. The United States clings to its self-declared hegemony or primacy at great risk to the whole world. So when you ask, will we get to something new? We will when the need for it is clear to everybody, and when the U.S. opposition finally wanes, and it will wane for two reasons. One is that the rest of the world will finally say to the United States, you don't run the show. This is basic. It's what President Lula said recently. He said, we don't need an emperor, referring to President Trump's demands on Brazil and on other places in the world. And second, when the American public opinion, which supports the UN and wants an end to the wars, finally regains some political power, because in the U.S., public opinion plays almost no role right now. This is a government by decree ruled by the military-industrial complex, irrespective of the will of the American people who want peace, who want mutual accommodation, who don't want the wars in the Middle East or Ukraine or in East Asia, but their voice doesn't register right now. So we can get to a multipolar world if the BRICS and other countries say yes. Actually, I should be more precise. We can get to a law-based multilateral world. We already are in a multipolar world, but we can get to a multilateral world with an effective UN charter if the BRICS, the African Union, ASEAN, other countries in the world say, we do not want an emperor. We do not take demands from any one country. We want to operate by the international rule of law. And if at the same time we can regain some measure of accountability of the U.S. military-industrial complex.
Thank you very much for your insight. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.